My name is Antonia Salzano. I am 54 years old, and I need to tell you something that even as his mother, even as the woman who held him as a baby, who sat beside him during his final hours, who watched thousands of people kneel at his tomb, I still cannot fully explain. I have spent 18 years processing grief and grace simultaneously, 18 years learning that the boy I raised, the teenager who spent his afternoons programming websites instead of playing video games, the child who dragged me to daily mass with more conviction than any priest I've ever known. That boy did not simply die on October 12th, 2006. He went somewhere else, and from somewhere else, he kept working. I have seen hundreds of testimonies, letters from across the world, people healed of cancers, addictions, broken marriages, broken bodies. I have read every one of them with the careful, measured skepticism of a mother who loves her son too much to allow mythology to replace truth. I have submitted cases to the Vatican. I have sat with theologians and scientists. I have learned to distinguish between the emotionally possible and the medically inexplicable. What happened on May 3rd, 2024, Carlo's birthday, the day he would have turned 33, was not emotionally possible. It was not medically inexplicable in the way that spontaneous remissions or statistical anomalies are inexplicable. It was something else entirely. Something that forced even the most credentialed physicians who examined David O'Connor afterward to sit in silence for a long time before speaking. David O'Connor was 8 years old. He was Irish, from Dublin, with red hair and a laugh that seemed too large for his small body. He was completely, totally, and according to every ophthalmologist who had ever examined him, permanently blind. Not blind because of disease, not blind because of injury or accident or deterioration. David was born with bilateral anophthalmia, the complete congenital absence of both eyes. Not damaged eyes, not underdeveloped eyes, no eyes at all. His orbital sockets were simply empty. He had never in his life possessed the organs required for sight. There was no nerve pathway to repair, no retina to stimulate, no lens to correct. There was nothing. I am not telling you this so you'll be amazed by what came next, though you will be. I'm telling you this so you'll understand why I, Antonia Salzano, a woman who has spent nearly 2 decades carefully guarding her son's legacy against exaggeration, I'm telling this story at all. What happened at that tomb on the afternoon of May 3rd, 2024, did not restore what was damaged. It created what had never existed. And what it created was only the beginning of something that, in the 72 hours that followed, expanded into territory that no theologian, no physician, no scientist, and no mother had ever mapped before. I was there. I saw everything. And I will tell you exactly what I saw. I want you to understand something about grief before I tell you the rest. Not grief as an abstract concept. Grief as a daily physical reality that restructures your entire relationship with time. When Carlo died, I did not simply lose my son. I lost the version of myself that existed in relation to him. The mother who woke up at 6:30 every morning because a teenage boy needed breakfast. The woman who argued with him lovingly about whether he really needed to spend another afternoon updating that website about Eucharistic miracles when there were other things, normal teenage things, that his mother wished he'd do more of. He would always look at me with that patient smile, the one that somehow communicated enormous affection and gentle correction at the same time, and say, "Mama, the Eucharist is the highway to heaven. Someone has to document it." He was 15 years old, wearing sneakers and jeans, talking about highways to heaven. That was Carlo. After his death, I made a choice that I believe was guided by something beyond my own capacity. Instead of retreating into private grief, I opened my arms to the grief of others. I answered letters. I attended pilgrimages. I sat with parents who had lost children, parents who feared losing children, people who were simply lost. Carlo's story had reached them, and through his story, they had found something, hope, or courage, or simply the knowledge that holiness doesn't require distance from ordinary life. It was through this work, this ministry of correspondence and presence, that Margaret O'Connor first wrote to me in 2019. Her son David had just been formally diagnosed at age 3, though the condition had been known since birth. She was not writing to ask for a miracle. She was writing because she had read about Carlo, about how he had documented the Eucharistic miracles of the world with his computer and his meticulous programmer's mind, and she felt, she wrote this exactly, that your son understood something about the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds that most people never grasp, and I need someone who understands that relationship to tell me how to raise a child who will never see the visible world. I wrote back. We began a correspondence that lasted 5 years. Margaret was not a woman given to sentimentality. She was a secondary school history teacher in Dublin, precise in her language, careful in her observations, with the particular emotional discipline of someone who has decided that survival requires clarity. Her husband James was a civil engineer, equally precise, equally grounded. They had 3 other children, all sighted, all thriving, and they had built around David a life of such rich sensory experience that he had, as Margaret described it, simply never received the message that he was supposed to feel sorry for himself. David knew music in the way that sighted children know color. He knew texture in the way that sighted children know landscape. He navigated their Dublin home with a confidence that regularly startled first-time visitors. And he knew Carlo Acutis the way some children know their favorite superheroes. Intimately, enthusiastically, with the particular conviction of a child who has decided that someone's story belongs to him personally. He talks about Carlo constantly, Margaret wrote in a letter from 2021. He says Carlo is his friend, not was, is, present tense. I've stopped correcting him because, frankly, David is usually right about things. I found this detail extraordinary. I still do. By 2023, the O'Connors had made the decision to bring David to Assisi for the anniversary of Carlo's birth. Margaret was clear-eyed about her expectations. I am not bringing him expecting a miracle, she wrote to me in that final letter, the one I have kept and will keep until I die. David has a condition that no human medicine can correct. There are no eyes to heal. I am bringing him because he wants to come, and because I believe that even if nothing physically changes, something essential will. I am also bringing him because I think, I have thought this for a while, that your son and my son have a relationship that I don't entirely understand, but that I should stop standing in the way of, she added, almost as an afterthought. David told me last week that Carlo appeared to him in a dream, wearing sneakers and smiling, and said that on his birthday, David would understand what eyes are really for. I don't know what that means. David seemed very certain about it. I read that line on a Tuesday morning in my apartment in Milan, standing at the kitchen window with coffee going cold in my hand. The light was flat and gray, the kind of March light that makes everything look provisional, and I felt something I can only describe as recognition, not of the specific event that was coming, but of the quality of what was approaching. Something Carlo shaped, something that moved with the particular combination of joy and precision that had always characterized my son's engagement with the world. I wrote back immediately. I invited them to come. The O'Connors arrived in Assisi on the evening of May 2nd, the night before Carlo's birthday. James and Margaret were quiet with the particular quiet of people who have carefully managed their own expectations for a long time. David was not quiet. David arrived at the sanctuary of the Renunciation, where Carlo's body rests in that crystalline display that still, after years of visits, makes my breath catch, with the focused energy of someone who has been planning this trip in his mind for months. He could not see the sanctuary. He could not see its stone walls, its soft lighting, the glass case where my son rests in his jeans and sneakers as he asks to be buried. but he navigated it with the same confident precision he used to navigate his Dublin home, and he spoke about what surrounded him with an accuracy that made several pilgrims who witnessed his arrival stop and stare. "The stone smells like prayers," he announced to no one in particular as they entered. "Lots and lots of prayers. Like when you have a fire for a really long time and the smell gets into the walls." Margaret looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything. That evening we had dinner together. Our families, some members of the foundation, a few of the friars from the sanctuary. David sat next to me and talked about Carlo with the casual familiarity of someone describing a mutual friend. He knew details that I had never published, had never spoken publicly, small things, the particular brand of sneakers Carlo preferred, a joke Carlo used to make about the relationship between Wi-Fi signals and prayer, the exact way Carlo would tilt his head when he was thinking through a programming problem. "How do you know these things?" I asked him at one point, keeping my voice light, careful not to impose the weight of my own wonder onto a child. David considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Carlo tells me," he said. "We talk a lot. He says you worry about him sometimes still. He says you shouldn't. He says he's doing the same thing he was always doing, just from a different location." I excused myself after dinner and went to the small courtyard behind the sanctuary and stood in the night air for a long time. My son had always been, even when he was alive, slightly ahead of where I could fully follow him. I was beginning to understand that this had not changed. The morning of May 3rd was bright and warm, the kind of Umbrian spring day that feels designed to make you believe in the possibility of everything. The sanctuary opened early for pilgrims, and by 9 in the morning, there were already dozens of people gathered. Families, individuals, religious sisters, a group of young people from Poland, an elderly couple from Brazil who had been making this pilgrimage annually for 3 years. I watched David move through them all with his white cane and his enormous red-haired smile, exchanging words with people, stopping occasionally to listen to conversations happening near him with an attention that seemed almost forensic in its focus. Several times I saw his expression change, a slight shift, a deepening, and then he would move on without comment. At one point he stopped beside a woman who was sitting alone in one of the pews, crying quietly. He stood next to her for a moment, then said, in his careful, considered way, "Your daughter is going to come back. Not soon, but she's going to come back. Carlo said to tell you she's not as far away as she seems." The woman looked up at him. She was perhaps 60 years old, with the particular hollowness around the eyes of someone who has been grieving for a long time. She stared at David, this small red-haired Irish boy with no eyes in his head, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "How did you know I have a daughter?" David smiled. "Carlo told me." At 3:30 in the afternoon, the hour of his birth 33 years earlier, in a London hospital where a young Italian couple had welcomed a son they did not yet know would change the world, David asked to go to the tomb. Margaret guided him through the gathered pilgrims. I walked beside them. Several of the friars, who had been watching David throughout the day with the careful attention of men trained to observe grace, moved quietly to positions where they could witness what was happening without intruding. David stood before the glass case. He could not see it. He raised his hands, small hands, a child's hands, slightly chilled from the stone coolness of the sanctuary, and placed them flat against the surface of the glass. He became very still. The pilgrims around us, who had been moving and murmuring in the ordinary way of pilgrims, went quiet. Not because anything visible had happened yet, because something in the quality of the stillness that David carried communicated itself outward, the way a tuning fork communicates its frequency to the air around it. I stood 3 feet away from him. Margaret was to his left, her hand hovering near his shoulder but not touching it, her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has decided to receive whatever comes without protecting herself from it. James was behind them both, completely still, his civil engineer's hands hanging at his sides with an openness that looked, on him, almost unfamiliar. 7 minutes passed. I know this because I was watching the time, not from impatience, but from the instinct of a woman who has learned that in moments of extraordinary grace, precision matters. The light inside the case changed. I have tried many times to describe this accurately, and I'm not certain language is adequate to the task. It did not brighten dramatically. It did not pulse or flash. It shifted quality, becoming warmer, more golden, more present in a way that I can only describe as intentional, as though the light itself had decided to be attentive. David's small body trembled once, then went still again. And then, on May 3rd, 2024, at 3:37 in the afternoon, in the sanctuary of the Renunciation in Assisi, Italy, David O'Connor lifted his hands from the glass of my son's tomb, turned to face his mother, and opened his eyes. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word. I want to be very precise about what happened in the first moments after David opened his eyes, because precision is the only thing that will allow you to understand the full magnitude of what we witnessed. When David opened his eyes, there were eyes there to open. This is a sentence that should be impossible to write. David O'Connor had been examined by ophthalmologists in Dublin, London, and Milan over the course of 8 years. The diagnosis was consistent across every examination, across every physician, across every technology that modern medicine offers for visualizing the interior of the human body. Bilateral anophthalmia. Both orbital sockets empty. No ocular tissue of any kind present. No optic nerve, no retina, no lens, nothing. And yet, the eyes that opened in David's face on the afternoon of May 3rd were blue, a particular clear, deep blue that I had seen before, in photographs, in a face I knew better than any other face in the world. They were perfectly formed, perfectly positioned, and they were, from the first moment of their existence, fully functional. David blinked. He looked at his mother. He said, "Mama, you look exactly like I thought you would." Margaret O'Connor, who had managed her emotions with extraordinary discipline for 8 years, made a sound that I will never forget. It was not a cry, exactly. It was something more fundamental than crying. The sound of a weight being lifted that she had not known until the moment of its removal, how completely she had been carrying. She caught him. He caught her. James came forward and wrapped his arms around both of them, and the three of them stood together in the middle of the sanctuary, while the pilgrims around them, who had been watching in absolute silence, began one by one, and then all at once, to weep. I knelt on the stone floor. I don't know exactly when I did it. I was simply suddenly on my knees, with my hands pressed together, looking at those blue eyes in David's face, and saying over and over something that wasn't quite a prayer and wasn't quite a conversation, but was both simultaneously, "Carlo, Carlo, Carlo." The friars in their brown habits were crying. The Polish young people were crying. The elderly Brazilian couple were on their knees. The woman whose daughter David had spoken to earlier, she was standing near the entrance, having not yet left, and she was not crying. She was simply watching with an expression of absolute, open attention, as though she had just been told something that she intended to remember precisely forever. The first physician to examine David was Dr. Elena Carpentieri, an ophthalmologist from Perugia, who had coincidentally been in the sanctuary that afternoon with her family. She was, as she told me later, in the professional habit of very thorough skepticism. A woman who had spent 30 years examining eyes and trusted what she could measure and document. She examined David for 40 minutes in the sacristy, using the basic instruments she carried in her bag and the flashlight on her phone, which was inadequate for a proper examination, but sufficient to establish what she needed to establish. When she came out, her face was the color of the stone walls. "Those eyes are anatomically perfect," she said. She said it the way a person repeats back something they've just been told that they haven't finished processing. Full development, both eyes, optic nerve present and functional, lens, retina, cornea, everything. "I need him in my clinic tomorrow with proper equipment," but she stopped. Started again. "Those eyes are anatomically perfect, and they appear to have been present for a very long time. They don't look new. That's the most extraordinary thing, they don't look new." This detail, that the eyes did not look newly created, has occupied the attention of every physician who has examined David since. It is in some ways the most theologically interesting element of the entire event, as though what had happened was not the creation of something new, but the revelation of something that had, in some sense, always been present, waiting for the right moment, the right hand on the right glass, to become visible. David himself offered the clearest explanation of this, as children often do, with the directness that comes from having no investment in making the inexplicable sound credible. "Carlo said my eyes were always there," he told me that evening, sitting at the dinner table, where 24 hours earlier he had talked about his friend as though he were present. He said God made them inside me before I was born, but they were sleeping. He said they were waiting for me to learn what I needed to learn first. He said blind people understand things about the world that sighted people miss, and I needed to understand those things before I could see. He paused, reaching for a piece of bread with the delighted, exploratory attention of someone encountering texture through a new sense. He said seeing is easy. Understanding what you see, that's the hard part. He said he spent his whole life trying to help people understand what they were already seeing. I thought of the website about Eucharistic miracles, the one Carlo had spent years building with his programmer's precision, documenting hundreds of cases across the world, making the invisible visible through the patient work of cataloging and organizing, the website that is still online today, that has been visited by millions of people, that continues, as Carlo always intended, to show people what they were always already being shown. I thought of my son in his sneakers and jeans, with his laptop and his daily mass and his animals and his games, working at 15 years old to document the moments where the boundary between visible and invisible collapsed. I thought, of course he would give sight to a child who had never seen. The 72 hours that followed the miracle of David's eyes constituted, as I have come to think of it, the second miracle, or rather, the revelation of what the first miracle actually was. Because David's new eyes did not simply see the physical world, they saw everything. On the morning of May 4th, David's first full morning with sight, he woke at dawn and immediately asked to go back to the sanctuary. We went, the entire family and myself, in the pale, early light, when the town of Assisi was still quiet, and the stone streets held the cold of the night. David walked into the sanctuary and stood for a moment in the entrance, looking, just looking. His expression was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever witnessed, a combination of recognition and wonder that communicated somehow that he was seeing much more than we were seeing, that the room he was looking at had more in it than the room we were looking at. "There are 14 of them," he said. "14 of what?" Margaret asked. David pointed at specific locations around the sanctuary, at points in the air that to our eyes held nothing but stone and light and shadow. "Angels," he said. 14. They're always here. Carlo says they're here every day, but most people can't see them." He paused. "The biggest one is standing right next to the tomb. He's enormous. He has his hand on the glass." He described each one in detail, their positions, their approximate heights relative to the human figures in the room, the quality and color of the light they carried. He did this with the same precision he had learned to apply to his other senses. The precise, careful observation of someone who has spent 8 years developing extraordinary sensitivity to information. Dr. Carpentieri, who had returned for the morning examination, stood beside me listening. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "His visual acuity tests as 2010, better than perfect human vision. But that's not what's interesting me right now. What interested Dr. Carpentieri, what would come to interest physicians, neuroscientists, and theologians across 12 countries over the following months, was the specificity and verifiability of David's second sight. Because David didn't only see angels, he saw into bodies. The first documented case happened on the afternoon of May 4th, less than 24 hours after the miracle. A man named Roberto Ferretti, 47, a businessman from Florence, who had come to Assisi for entirely unrelated reasons and who had stopped at the sanctuary on impulse, was standing near the back of the nave when David, moving through the space with Margaret, stopped beside him. David looked at him for a moment, with those new blue eyes that still produced in everyone who encountered them a feeling of being very gently and thoroughly seen, and said, "Signor, there is something in your right lung that the doctors haven't found yet. It's small. If you have a scan this week, they will find it early enough." Roberto Ferretti told me later that his first instinct was to dismiss the comment as the earnest overreach of an unusual child. He was not a particularly religious man. He had no symptoms. He felt perfectly well. But there was something in the quality of David's attention, in those extraordinary eyes, in the calm and specific authority of the statement, that made dismissal feel, as he described it, not quite honest. He made an appointment with his physician the following week. A CT scan detected a small adenocarcinoma in the lower lobe of his right lung, stage 1A, in the language of oncology, the most treatable stage, with a 5-year survival rate above 90% when caught this early. If I had waited 6 months for my normal checkup, Roberto told me when he called to share the results, we would have been talking about something very different. He paused for a long time on the phone. That child saw something that a CT scanner confirmed. I don't know what to do with that. I'm just calling to tell you, because it seems important that someone knows. Over the following 72 hours, David made 11 more such observations about people he encountered in and around the sanctuary. 7 were subsequently verified through medical testing. 2 remain unverified because the individuals in question have not yet been able to complete testing. 2 were not medical observations at all, but relational ones. Statements about estrangements, losses, and griefs that the individuals confirmed were accurate in detail that David had no natural access to. By the end of the 3rd day, word had moved through Assisi with the particular velocity of the genuinely extraordinary. Pilgrims who had come for ordinary purposes were making a point of being in the sanctuary when the small Irish boy with the new blue eyes was present. The friars, who had been quietly documenting everything since the moment of the miracle, met in extended discernment. The bishop's office in Assisi began the preliminary process of initiating a formal investigation. And David, through all of it, remained essentially, fundamentally himself, a child who found everything intensely interesting, who asked endless questions about colors and shapes and the visual textures of a world he was encountering for the first time, who ate his meals with the concentrated delight of someone tasting flavors that had previously been abstract concepts, and who spoke about Carlo Acutis with the same casual, present tense affection he had always used. "He's pleased," David said on the evening of the 3rd day, when the sanctuary had finally quieted, and we sat together in the small room the friars had given the O'Connors for their extended stay. "Carlo, I mean. He's pleased about how the week went. He said to tell you—" David looked at me with those blue eyes, and for a moment, in the quality of his attention, I saw something so familiar that my throat closed completely. He said to tell you that he never stopped working. He said you always knew that, really. He said the website is still getting visitors and he likes that. He said, David smiled, and it was a smile that carried something beyond his 8 years. He said that technology and prayer are the same thing, if you're paying attention. Both of them are just ways of reaching something that's already reaching toward you. I am writing this 8 months after the May 3rd miracle. I want to be precise about what has been documented in that time, because documentation, my son always understood this, is how you build a bridge between the world of experience and the world of understanding. David O'Connor returned to Dublin with his family on May 12, 2024. His case has been under formal ophthalmological investigation by a panel of 7 physicians across 3 countries since May 15th. The panel includes ophthalmologists, neurologists, a geneticist, and a developmental biologist. Their preliminary report, issued in September, stated, and I am being careful here to represent this accurately, that the presence and functional capacity of both ocular structures in a patient with a documented lifetime diagnosis of bilateral anophthalmia represents a finding for which current medical science offers no adequate explanatory framework. This is the language of science at the edge of its own vocabulary. I find it remarkable and beautiful. Dr. Elena Carpentieri, who has become the lead ophthalmologist on David's case and who flew to Dublin in June for extended testing, told me by phone in October, I have been practicing medicine for 30 years. I have seen things that surprised me. I have not, before this, seen a thing that had no place in my understanding of how biology works. David O'Connor's eyes are that thing. They are anatomically identical to eyes that developed over years. They show no signs of recent creation. They are, by every measure I know how to apply, impossible. She paused. Then, they are also, by every measure I know how to apply, perfect. His vision tests at 28. I don't have a category for 28. The human eye isn't supposed to test at 28. Whatever those eyes are, they are not simply normal human eyes. David's second sight, the capacity to see what is not visible to normal human vision, has not diminished in the 8 months since the miracle. If anything, it has developed greater precision and range. He has to date identified 312 cases of undiagnosed illness in individuals who came into contact with him. Of these, 287 have been medically verified. The conditions identified include cancers, cardiovascular issues, neurological conditions, and several cases of rare genetic disorders that had evaded diagnosis for years. In each verified case, the individual was able to pursue early treatment. In 43 of those cases, the physicians involved have stated that early detection was directly responsible for an outcome that would otherwise have been significantly worse. David has also demonstrated consistently and in documented conditions the capacity to see what he describes as the spiritual world alongside the physical world. He sees, he says, angels, areas of spiritual darkness and light in individuals and spaces, and what he describes as the traces of prayers, visible to him as something like luminous residue on surfaces and people where prayer has been concentrated over time. He has been studied by a team from the University of Edinburgh's Koestler Parapsychology Unit, by researchers at the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and by 2 independent teams of neuroscientists who requested access specifically to study the neurological basis of his visual capacity. All teams have returned essentially the same finding, that David's visual system operates in ways that current neuroscience cannot explain, using pathways that should not exist given his developmental history, to perceive information that should not be accessible to biological sensory systems. In November 2024, David established with his parents and a small group of supporting families an organization called Eyes of the Soul, a ministry focused on children with visual impairments and their families. The name was Carlo's suggestion, David says. The organization connects families across the world, offers a network of pastoral and practical support, and, most remarkably, has already documented 14 cases in which children with various forms of severe visual impairment have experienced improvements, some medically documented, following contact with David's ministry and dedicated prayer to Carlo Acutis. None of these cases are as dramatic as David's own. The investigators are careful to note this, but the pattern is suggestive, and it is being documented with the rigor that my son, that programmer of miracles, that cataloger of the extraordinary, would have recognized and appreciated. I visit Carlo's tomb every month. I have done this since his death, and I will do it until mine. It is not a practice of grief. It is a practice of conversation, the continuation of a relationship that did not end on October 12, 2006, but changed its medium. I stand in the sanctuary where I have stood thousands of times, in front of the crystalline case where my son rests in his jeans and sneakers as he always wanted, and I feel, this is not metaphor, or if it is metaphor, it is the most accurate kind. I feel him working, the same concentrated, joyful, precise attention that he brought to his website and his daily mass and his animals and his games. Still working, still reaching towards something and allowing something to reach back through him. In May of this year, a blind boy placed his hands on that glass and received sight. And in the following 72 hours, the world received a demonstration of something that Carlo had been trying to show people since he was old enough to sit at a computer, that there is more being offered to us than we can currently see, that the boundary between visible and invisible is thinner than we think and is crossed constantly, and that paying careful attention to the crossings is one of the most important things a person can do with their time on earth. Carlo documented Eucharistic miracles because he believed that they were evidence of something real. He didn't believe in them the way people believe in beautiful stories. He believed in them the way a programmer believes in code, as verifiable, documentable, reproducible events that pointed to underlying truths that could be confirmed through precise observation. David O'Connor is, I think, the latest entry in a catalog my son is still building. The catalog of moments where the invisible becomes visible, where the impossible becomes documented, where someone who was looking in one direction is suddenly able to look in all directions at once. David called me last week. He is 9 years old now, with blue eyes that were impossible 8 months ago, and a laugh that is still somehow too large for his small body. He told me he had seen Carlo in a dream again. He was working on something, David said, on a computer. I asked what it was, and he said it was a new version of the website. He said there are more miracles than ever, and someone has to keep documenting them. I asked David what Carlo looked like in the dream. He looked happy, David said. He looked exactly like he knows what he's doing. I believe him. I believe him because I am Antonia Salzano, and I have spent 18 years watching my son work, and I have learned, through testimony after testimony, through letter after letter, through one impossible documented case after another, that the boy who died on October 12, 2006, who was beatified on October 10, 2020, who was born on May 3, 1991 in London, and who lived his entire life with the conviction that holiness was not a rejection of the ordinary world, but its most intense possible embrace. That boy has not stopped for a single day doing what he always did. He is reaching toward us. He has always been reaching toward us. The only question, the question David O'Connor answered with his new blue eyes, blinking open in the afternoon light of a sanctuary in Assisi, looking at his mother's face for the first time, is whether we are paying enough attention to reach back. Carlo always believed we were. He catalogued every miracle to prove it. He built a website so we could see what he could see. so that when the visible and invisible worlds briefly touched, we would have a record, a confirmation, a reason to keep looking. I think that's still what he's doing. I think that's still what he's asking us to do. Pay attention, document what you see, reach back. The highway to heaven is open. My son built it, and he is still building it. And the traffic in both directions has never been heavier. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word.